The city unfolded 95 stories below, a silent, glittering tapestry of light and motion. Up here, in the heart of Aurelia, the world was different. It was a realm of hushed tones and calculated power, a sanctuary carved from glass and steel at the very apex of the skyline. The air itself seemed filtered, carrying the scent of old money, expensive leather, and the faintest hint of truffle oil from the kitchen. Constellations of crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light refracted into 1,000 tiny rainbows on the polished obsidian floors. The clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain was the only percussion in a symphony of whispered negotiations and world-altering deals. Every detail, from the weight of the water glasses to the seamless floor-to-ceiling windows that erased the boundary between the restaurant and the sky, was designed to reinforce a single, unspoken truth. This was not a place for ordinary people. This was a throne room for the gods of finance and industry, a place where the fate of the millions of ants scurrying in the streets below was decided over plates of seared scallops and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. It was a world of cold, untouchable, and astronomically expensive power, and it operated with the silent, flawless precision of a Swiss watch. Moving through this rarefied atmosphere was a ghost in a crisp black uniform. Her name was Alara Vance, but to the patrons of Aurelia, she was not a person with a name or a history. She was a function, an extension of the restaurant's seamless service. Her movements were a study in efficiency, a ballet of practiced economy, as she navigated the spaces between tables laden with culinary art. She refilled water glasses before they were half empty, cleared plates with a silence that bordered on supernatural, and maintained a face of serene, professional neutrality. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask, revealing nothing of the furious, brilliant mind operating beneath. As she moved, her brain was not thinking about the wine pairings or the dessert specials. It was unconsciously calculating vectors, mapping the most efficient pathways through the dining room, processing spatial variables with a speed and accuracy that would have baffled a logistics expert. She saw the room not as a collection of tables and chairs, but as a complex, three-dimensional grid, a puzzle to be solved with every step. Her presence was so unobtrusive, so perfectly integrated into the background hum of the restaurant, that she had mastered the art of being completely invisible in plain sight. This invisibility was her shield, the armor that allowed her to function. Behind the mask, her mind was a tempest. Every clink of a champagne flute, every burst of entitled laughter, was a grating reminder of a world she had lost. As she placed a small, elegant dish before a hedge fund manager, the scent of his expensive cologne was replaced in her memory by the smell of sawdust and varnish from her father's workshop. She could see him as he was before, a man with calloused hands and a laugh that could shake a room, a community organizer who fought with every fiber of his being for the people of his neighborhood. Now, that man was a shadow, confined to a wheelchair in their small, cramped apartment, his brilliant mind trapped behind the fog of aphasia, his words lost somewhere between his brain and his tongue. The stroke had been a thief, stealing not just his health but the very essence of his spirit. And it had not been random. It was the direct result of the crushing, relentless stress of a legal and financial war waged against their community, a war they were always destined to lose. Ilara's own promising future, a full scholarship to MIT where she was a prodigy in urban planning and game theory, had vanished overnight. She had traded complex algorithms and civic blueprints for starched aprons and aching feet, all to pay for the medications and care her father desperately needed. Her motivation was not simply survival. It was a silent, burning vow to reclaim the dignity that had been stolen from them. You're about to witness an incredible story of resilience. As we get started, drop your city or country in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do it, so you're always here for stories like this. The delicate balance of the room shifted when Alistair Finch arrived. It was not a loud entrance, but the atmosphere seemed to compress around him, the ambient noise dipping for a fraction of a second as if in deference. The restaurant manager, a man who treated senators with polite detachment, scurried to his side, his posture bent in a display of pure sycophancy. Finch did not acknowledge him. He moved with the unshakable gravity of a man who owned not just the building, but the very ground it stood on. He was dressed in a bespoke suit of charcoal gray that probably cost more than Alara's annual salary, a Patek Philippe watch gleaming subtly at his wrist. It was his eyes, however, that truly defined him. They were the color of a winter sky, cold and utterly devoid of empathy, sweeping across the room and its occupants as if they were pieces on a chessboard he controlled. He didn't see people, he saw assets, liabilities, and obstacles. As he was led to the best table in the house, the one with the panoramic corner view, he waved a dismissive hand at the staff, a gesture that conveyed his complete and utter disinterest in their existence. He was a king in his court, and everyone else was merely part of the scenery. Seated with a younger, visibly nervous investor, Finch's voice cut through the restaurant's quiet hum. It was not loud, but it carried an inherent authority that demanded to be heard. He gestured toward the sprawling city below, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. He spoke of progress and revitalization, but his words were laced with the cold jargon of a corporate predator. He called the vibrant, historic neighborhoods of the city underutilized assets and their residents low-yield occupants. He boasted about his firm's ability to streamline urban renewal, a euphemism for a process of displacement and destruction that Alara knew all too well. He mocked the ants below, the millions of lives that were nothing more than variables in his profit calculations. To the young investor, it was a masterclass in ruthless capitalism. To Alara, who overheard his monologue as she passed by with a tray of fresh bread, his words were like shards of ice piercing her heart. A cold, familiar fury began to solidify in her veins, but her face remained a placid lake, her hands steady, her movements fluid and professional. As she approached their table to refill their water glasses, the light from the window caught Finch's face at a particular angle. It was a face she had seen before, not in person, but in grainy newspaper photos and on angry community forum posts from years ago. The name clicked into place in her mind with the force of a physical blow. Alistair Finch, CEO of Apex Global Properties, the architect of the Southwood Revitalization Project, the man whose name was on the legal notices that had piled up on their kitchen table like death warrants. The man whose campaign of intimidation and financial pressure had broken the spirit of their community and shattered her father's health. He didn't remember the faces of the people he had ruined, but she would never forget his. The water pitcher in her hand felt impossibly heavy. For a terrifying second, she felt the urge to drop it, to scream, to unleash the years of pent-up grief and rage. But she didn't. Instead, she channeled the firestorm inside her into an icy resolve, her grip tightening, her breath slowing, her focus sharpening to a razor's edge. The first sound was the splintering of wood as the heavy oak doors to the main dining room were kicked open. It was a sound so alien in this world of refined quiet that it took a moment for anyone to process it. Then came the screams. 5 men, their faces contorted with a raw, desperate fury, stormed into the restaurant. They were not slick criminals. They were broad-shouldered men in work boots and worn jackets, their movements clumsy but brutally effective. They were the contractors Finch had bankrupted on a project in another city, a fact they bellowed as they shoved aside tables and terrified patrons. Finch's 2 bodyguards, men built like mountains, moved to intercept them, but they were trained for controlled threats, not a chaotic, 5-pronged assault. One was taken down by a heavy fire extinguisher to the back of the knee, the other overwhelmed by a flurry of fists. The carefully curated piece of Aurelia was shattered into a million pieces. For the first time in what was likely decades, Alistair Finch was no longer in control. The mask of icy arrogance dissolved, replaced by a primal, undisguised terror. His face, usually a healthy, confident tan, turned a pasty, sickly white. He was shoved back against the panoramic window, the glittering city lights mockingly illuminating his powerlessness. The men surrounded him, their voices a cacophony of rage and accusation, spitting out figures, dates, and broken promises. They weren't there for his wallet. They were there for a pound of flesh. They wanted his humiliation. They wanted him to feel the same desperation he had inflicted upon them. He was cornered, trapped 95 stories in the sky, his wealth and influence utterly useless. A sheen of cold sweat broke out on his brow, his breath catching in a ragged, shallow gasp. The king was a king no more, just a terrified man, exposed and vulnerable before the very ants he so casually dismissed. While the world around her descended into panic and chaos, Ilara Vance became preternaturally calm. The screams of the patrons, the shouting of the attackers, the crashing of plates and glasses, it all faded into a low, distant hum. The terror that should have paralyzed her was instead a catalyst, igniting the dormant, analytical part of her brain. The years of grief and anger she carried for her father did not erupt into a blind rage. Instead, they were transmuted, forged into a diamond-hard focus. Her mind, a supercomputer built for game theory and logistical strategy, kicked into overdrive. She was no longer a waitress in a chaotic restaurant. She was a general on a battlefield. The fleeing diners were not people. They were mobile obstacles with predictable trajectories. The tables were not furniture. They were cover and concealment. The 5 attackers were hostile units with a singular focus, leaving them with exploitable blind spots. Her heart rate, which should have been skyrocketing, slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. In the midst of utter pandemonium, Ilara Vance saw not chaos, but a complex, solvable puzzle, and she was about to make her first move. Her hand moved with a speed that defied the chaos swirling around it, a blur of motion against the backdrop of panicked screams and crashing furniture. It was not the frantic, clumsy gesture of a person in terror, but the precise, economical action of a surgeon reaching for an instrument. Her fingers closed around a heavy silver salt shaker, its cool weight, a familiar anchor in a world that had just been torn from its axis. Another flick of her wrist, and its twin, the pepper shaker, was in her other hand. Her eyes, which had been scanning the room, taking in every variable, every panicked movement, every shifting shadow, now locked onto the pristine white tablecloth of Finch's abandoned table. A splash of deep red wine, spilled during the initial assault, stained the linen like a fresh wound. It was not a mess to her, it was a medium. This tablecloth was no longer a piece of fine dining linen. It had become her slate, her battlefield, her blueprint for survival. The chaos was not a threat. It was a set of parameters for the most important problem she had ever been asked to solve. The 2 bodyguards had been separated in the initial rush, one already down and groaning on the floor, the other pinned near the main entrance, struggling to hold off 2 of the attackers. Ilara's mind processed this instantly. Main exit compromised. Hostiles focused on a single point. Finch, the primary target, was momentarily forgotten by the attackers, his own terror rendering him a statue against the glass. He was the asset to be extracted. With a clinical detachment, she placed the salt shaker near the center of the wine stain. This was Finch. Then she placed the pepper shaker a few inches away. This was the remaining bodyguard, currently pinned but mobile. Her gaze flickered across the room, her mind superimposing the restaurant's architectural blueprints, which she had memorized on her first day, over the chaotic reality before her. She saw the load-bearing columns, the emergency exits, the hidden service corridors used by the staff. She saw the world in a way no one else in this room could possibly comprehend, a landscape of opportunity and risk, of pathways and choke points. Her fingers darted out again, snatching a heavy silver fork from the table setting. With a sharp, deliberate motion, she dragged its tines through the wine-soaked cloth, carving a thin red line away from the salt shaker representing Finch. The line was not straight. It curved sharply, a path that hugged the far wall, using a row of decorative, oversized planters as cover. The slight screech of the metal fork against the fibers of the linen was a sound only she could hear, a private signal in the symphony of destruction. The line bifurcated, one path leading toward the main kitchen doors, a predictable but heavily trafficked route. She ignored it. Instead, she carved a second, more daring line with a steak knife she plucked from the table. This line shot in the opposite direction, toward a small, unmarked door behind the bar. A door she knew led to a narrow service corridor that snaked its way down the core of the building, completely bypassing the main elevators and lobby. It was a route meant for moving garbage, not billionaires, but it was their only viable exit. She completed the diagram by placing a heavy water glass at the end of the service corridor line. This was the extraction point, the service elevator bay on the floor below. The entire sequence, from the moment she picked up the salt shaker to the moment she placed the water glass, took less than 10 seconds. On the tablecloth, a crude but brutally effective map was now clear, a diagram of survival drawn in wine and cutlery. It was a masterpiece of tactical improvisation, a physical manifestation of a mind that saw 3 moves ahead in a game where the stakes were life and death. She had taken the symbols of her servitude, the salt shakers, the forks, the glasses, and transformed them into the instruments of salvation. Her heart did not pound with fear. It beat with the steady, powerful rhythm of a mind completely and utterly in its element. She was no longer a waitress. She was in command. Her eyes lifted from the tablecloth and locked with the one remaining bodyguard across the room. He was a mountain of a man, his face a mask of grim determination as he fought to keep the attackers at bay. His training had prepared him for assassins and kidnappers, for clean, professional threats, not this raw, unpredictable explosion of blue-collar rage. He was losing ground. Ilara didn't shout. She didn't wave her arms. She simply held his gaze for a single, charged second. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, she dipped her chin toward the map on the table. Her expression was not one of panic or suggestion. It was an order. It was the calm, unshakable confidence of a general pointing the way through an enemy line. The bodyguard's eyes flickered from her face to the table, his brow furrowing in confusion for a fraction of a second. He saw the shakers, the fork, the glass. It was nonsense. Then something in his professional brain clicked. The confusion evaporated, replaced by a flash of stunned comprehension. He was trained to recognize patterns, to assess threats and opportunities in a split second. What he saw on that tablecloth was not a random mess. It was a language he understood. He saw the planters for cover. He saw the feint toward the kitchen. And he saw the service corridor, the forgotten back route that was their only chance. His eyes widened in disbelief. How could this woman, this ghost in a black uniform, have devised a flawless exfiltration plan in the middle of a war zone, a plan better than anything he could have conceived? There was no time to question it. He saw the genius, the sheer impossible brilliance of it. He gave Ilara a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement, a silent communication between 2 professionals on opposite ends of the social spectrum, united by the crisis. The decision was made. The bodyguard moved with explosive force. He shoved one of his assailants backward into the other, creating a precious 2-second window of chaos. He didn't run toward the main exit or the kitchen. He moved exactly as the wine-stained line on the tablecloth dictated. He lunged toward a still paralyzed Alistair Finch, grabbing the billionaire by the arm of his expensive suit with a grip of iron. Finch yelped, a pathetic, undignified sound that was swallowed by the noise of the room. He was no longer a person to the bodyguard. He was a package to be delivered. Dragging the sputtering CEO behind him, the bodyguard used the large, decorative planters as a shield, their lush foliage providing just enough cover to obscure their path from the attackers, who were now recovering their balance and shouting in renewed fury. The bodyguard moved with a purpose he hadn't possessed seconds earlier, his movements guided by the invisible map laid out by the invisible woman. The attackers, seeing their prize being dragged away, started to pursue, but their path was predictable. They headed toward the main kitchen entrance, the most obvious escape route, just as Ilara's rejected fork line had anticipated. They were being led on a false trail, their own assumptions used as a weapon against them. Meanwhile, the bodyguard, following the path of the steak knife, reached the small, unmarked door behind the bar. He kicked it open without breaking stride, revealing the dark, narrow service corridor beyond. He bundled the terrified Finch through the opening and disappeared inside, slamming the heavy steel door behind them. A moment later, the attackers realized their mistake and changed course. But it was too late. Their prey had vanished. The shouting continued, but its focus was gone. The immediate threat to Finch's life had been neutralized, not by force, but by a brilliant, silent act of strategic genius. The king had been saved by a pawn. Silence began to reclaim the room, not the elegant, hushed silence of before, but the ragged, unnerving silence that follows a violent explosion. Patrons slowly began to emerge from under tables, their faces pale with shock. The 5 attackers, their primary target gone, seemed to diffuse, their rage giving way to a sense of futile confusion. They stood amidst the wreckage, their shoulders slumping, suddenly looking less like monsters and more like what they were, desperate men who had just thrown their lives away. The restaurant manager was babbling into his phone, his voice trembling as he spoke to the police. But Alara's attention was fixed on the service door. She had done it. She had solved the puzzle. A strange, cold calm settled over her. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was the quiet hum of a powerful engine that had just been turned on for the first time in years. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was only the beginning. It was 20 minutes later when Alistair Finch returned. The police had arrived, the attackers were in custody, and a semblance of order had been restored. But Finch was not a man who had been saved. He was a man who had been desecrated. His suit was rumpled, a thin sheen of sweat still glistened on his forehead, and his eyes, once cold and calculating, now burned with a humiliated fury. He strode through the wreckage of his sanctuary, his gaze sweeping past the terrified staff and the gawking patrons until it landed on Alara. She was standing by her station, calmly picking up a fallen napkin, her face once again a mask of professional neutrality. He stalked toward her, his expensive leather shoes crunching on shards of broken glass. The bodyguard trailed behind him, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension as he watched his employer. He knew what Finch was about to do, and he knew it was wrong. Finch didn't speak at first. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick wad of cash, a brick of $100 bills held together by a gold money clip. The gesture was not one of gratitude. It was an act of erasure, a transaction designed to bury an uncomfortable truth. He shoved the money toward Alara, not into her hand, but pressing it hard against her chest. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, venomous snarl, meant for her ears alone. He said, "This is for your silence. You were never here. You saw nothing. You did nothing." He was not rewarding her. He was buying her complicity in a narrative where he had never been weak, never been saved, and certainly never been indebted to a person like her. He needed to believe that his survival was a matter of course, not the result of the quick thinking of a servant. The money was a gag, a tool to reinforce the wall between their worlds. For a long moment, Alara did not move. She simply looked at the wad of cash pressed against her uniform. In her mind's eye, she saw not the money, but the mountain of medical bills on her kitchen table. She saw the worn-out wheelchair her father used, the one with the squeaky wheel she couldn't afford to fix. She saw the bland, institutional food he had to eat because she couldn't afford the fresh ingredients he loved. This money could change all of that. It could provide a month, maybe 2, of comfort and relief. It was a temptation born of desperation, a lifeline offered by the very man who had drowned her family in the first place. A bitter, acidic taste filled her mouth. The image of her father's vibrant, laughing face before the stroke flashed through her mind, followed by the hollow, vacant look in his eyes now. This man's money was stained with her father's stolen future, with the ashes of their community, with a grief so profound it had become a part of her DNA. With a slow, deliberate movement, she raised her hand. Her fingers were long and slender, but her touch was firm as she closed them around Finch's wrist. She did not slap his hand away. She simply pushed it back, forcing him to take back the bundle of cash. Her eyes, which had been downcast in a posture of service for years, lifted to meet his. For the first time, he was forced to truly look at her, not as a function, but as a person. What he saw there was not fear, or gratitude, or even anger. It was an unnerving stillness, a profound and unshakable calm that seemed to absorb his rage and reflect it back at him. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, yet it cut through the post-chaos din of the restaurant with the clarity of a ringing bell. She said, "My help isn't for sale, Mr. Finch." The words were simple, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow, a complete rejection of his worldview. Finch stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief that quickly curdled into incandescent rage. He could not comprehend her refusal. In his world, everything and everyone had a price. Dignity was a commodity, and loyalty was something you leased. For her to reject his money was not an act of integrity, it was an act of defiance. He saw it as a threat, a shakedown, the opening move in a negotiation for a higher price. The idea that she might possess a moral code that he could not buy was so alien to him that his mind simply could not process it. He saw her calm demeanor not as strength, but as a calculated insult, a deliberate attempt to prolong his humiliation. The debt he owed her was a stain on his authority, and her refusal to accept payment made the stain permanent. He had to erase it. He had to erase her. He spun around, his eyes locking onto the restaurant manager who was hovering nearby, wringing his hands. Finch didn't need to raise his voice. His fury was a palpable force, a cold wave that washed over the manager, who visibly flinched. Finch pointed a trembling finger at Ilara. He said, "She's fired. Get her out of my sight. Now." He made it clear that she was not just to be dismissed from her shift. She was to be permanently removed, her employment records scrubbed, any trace of her existence in this place wiped clean. He wanted her gone, cast back into the anonymity of the city below, a clear and brutal message to anyone who might ever consider defying him. The power he had briefly lost during the attack was now being reasserted with a vengeance, directed at the one person who had saved him. It was a petty, pathetic display, the desperate act of a weak man trying to feel strong again. The manager, a man whose spine was made of jelly, scurried to do his bidding. He avoided Ilara's gaze, mumbling apologies and excuses as he gestured for another staff member to escort her to the locker room. There was no argument, no severance, no discussion. The verdict had been delivered from on high, and the sentence was immediate. Ilara felt a strange sense of detachment as she was led away. The shock of being fired was dulled by the cold, hard certainty that had been growing inside her since she first recognized Finch's face. This was not an ending. It was an ignition. As she walked past his table, the scene of her brief, brilliant command, her eyes fell upon his briefcase. It had been knocked to the floor during the struggle and had snapped open, its contents slightly dislodged. It was a small detail in the grand scheme of the room's destruction, something no one else would have noticed. But Ilara noticed everything. Her eyes, trained to see patterns and anomalies, were immediately drawn to a single piece of paper that had slid partially out from a leather folder. It was a preliminary architectural proposal, the crisp lines and technical jargon instantly familiar to her. The title at the top of the page read, Project Northgate Towers. Her blood ran cold. Northgate was a neighborhood just a few miles from Southwood, her old home. It was a place with the same profile, a tight-knit, working-class community sitting on undervalued but strategically located land. A wave of nausea washed over her. She knew, with the sickening certainty of a recurring nightmare, what this document represented. It was a death warrant. It was the exact same playbook, the same predatory strategy cloaked in the language of urban renewal that had destroyed her life once before. As the staff member impatiently urged her along, her gaze dropped to the bottom of the page. There, scrawled in an arrogant, decisive hand, was a signature, Alistair Finch. The name was a brand, a searing mark that connected the abstract monster from her past to the tangible, hateful man who had just fired her. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The vague suspicions, the whispers from years ago, the unresolved anger, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. This man, this titan of industry, was personally and directly responsible for her father's ruin. The knowledge did not break her, it forged her. The years of passive grief and quiet suffering were over. In that moment, a new equation formed in her mind. A new strategy began to take shape. Justice was no longer an abstract hope. It was a solvable problem. She was escorted to the staff locker room, a cramped, windowless space that smelled of bleach and old shoes. She mechanically changed out of her uniform, the crisp black and white fabric suddenly feeling like a costume from a life that was no longer hers. Her movements were calm and deliberate, but her mind was a whirlwind of activity. Project Northgate Towers. The name echoed in her thoughts. She knew she had to act, and she had to act now. Finch would move quickly, burying the community in a blizzard of legal paperwork and zoning applications before they even knew what was happening. She had seen it happen before. This time, she would not be a spectator. This time, she would be a player in the game. She pulled out her old, cracked smartphone, her fingers flying across the screen as she searched for a number she hadn't dialed in years. She found it under the name Professor Albright. Dr. Alistair Albright had been her mentor at MIT, a brilliant and fiercely ethical professor of civic engineering and game theory. He had been devastated when she'd been forced to drop out, telling her that it was a profound loss not just for her, but for the field of urban planning. He had always seen the unique power of her mind, her ability to humanize complex systems and find elegant solutions to intractable problems. She hesitated for only a moment, her thumb hovering over the call button. Reaching out to him felt like admitting the full scope of her failure, the vast distance between the promising prodigy she had been and the fired waitress she was now. But that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She pressed the button, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. The phone rang twice before he picked up. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, warm, inquisitive, and sharp as a tack. "Professor Albright, it's Alara Vance." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a sound of genuine, delighted surprise. "Alara! My goodness, it's been too long. How are you?" The simple, kind question almost broke her composure. She took a steadying breath, the sterile smell of the locker room filling her lungs. She told him everything, her voice low and steady as she recounted the events of the evening. She described the attack, the chaos, and her impossible intervention. She told him about Finch, about being fired, and, most importantly, about the document she saw, the proposal for Northgate Towers. She laid out the facts with the clinical precision of an analyst delivering a report, stripping the story of its emotion and leaving only the cold, hard data. As she spoke, she could hear the tone on the other end of the line shifting. The warmth in Professor Albright's voice was replaced by a growing sense of alarm, which then hardened into a cold, intellectual fury. He was a man who had dedicated his life to the idea of building better, more equitable cities, and he recognized the predatory patterns in her story immediately. "Alistair Finch," he murmured, his voice laced with contempt. "I know the name. A corporate vulture of the highest order. He uses the law as a bludgeon and calls it progress." He listened without interruption as Alara finished her story, the signature on the document being the final, damning piece of evidence. When she was done, there was a long silence on the line. Alara held her breath, the entire future of her newfound resolve hanging in that single moment of quiet. Then Professor Albright spoke, and his voice was no longer just that of a concerned mentor. It was the voice of an ally, a co-conspirator. "Alara," he said, "what that man did to your family, and what he is planning to do to the people of Northgate, is not just immoral. It is a perversion of everything our discipline is supposed to stand for. We are meant to build communities, not dismantle them for profit. He paused, and she could hear the conviction in his next words. You need resources. You need access to zoning archives, financial databases, and legal precedents. You need a place to work. My lab at the university is at your disposal. Everything we have is yours to use. Consider MIT your new headquarters. It was more than an offer of help. It was an activation. He was giving her the keys to the arsenal she needed to fight this war. A wave of profound relief washed over Ilara, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She wasn't alone anymore. The brilliant, strategic part of her brain, which had been dormant for so long, was now fully awake, and it finally had a place to operate. Thank you, Professor, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she refused to let spill over. I won't let you down, he replied. I know you won't, Ilara. You were always my most brilliant student. It's time the world saw why. As she ended the call, she looked at her reflection in the polished metal of the locker door. The tired waitress in the cheap clothes was gone. In her place, she saw the faint outline of the person she was always meant to be. A strategist, a fighter, a protector. Alistair Finch had fired a waitress. He had no idea that he had just declared war on a queen. She walked out of the restaurant, not through the staff exit in the back, but through the main doors. She moved through the lingering police officers and the shaken staff with her head held high, her posture straight and confident. The world of Aurelia, with its crystal chandeliers and its hushed, expensive power, no longer intimidated her. It was just another system, another puzzle box with its own set of rules and vulnerabilities. She had seen behind the curtain, had witnessed the fragility of the man at the top, and she was no longer impressed by the scenery. The cold night air of the city hit her face as she stepped onto the street, 95 stories below the scene of her dismissal and rebirth. The city lights, which had once seemed so distant and mocking from the restaurant window, now looked like a vast, interconnected network, a circuit board she was about to rewire. Her small, cramped apartment felt different when she arrived. The familiar weight of despair that usually greeted her at the door was absent, replaced by a thrumming, focused energy. Her father was asleep in his room, his breathing soft and rhythmic. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him. The sight of his frail form, a shadow of the powerful man he once was, did not fill her with sadness tonight. Instead, it filled her with a white-hot, diamond-hard resolve. This was for him. Every step she was about to take, every risk she was about to run, was to reclaim the justice that had been stolen from this man, sleeping peacefully, unaware that his daughter had just become a warrior on his behalf. She was no longer just his caregiver, she was his champion. She went to her small desk, cluttered with overdue bills and medical pamphlets, and pushed them all aside. She pulled out a clean sheet of paper and a pen. At the top of the page, she wrote 2 words, Alistair Finch. Beneath his name, she began to draw a new kind of map. It was not a map of streets and corridors, but a map of power. She drew lines connecting his company, Apex Global Properties, to shell corporations, to city officials, to zoning boards. She began to sketch out the network of influence and corruption that allowed men like him to operate with impunity. Her mind was on fire. Memories of old lectures, case studies, and theoretical models flooding back to her. No longer academic exercises, but practical weapons in her new arsenal. The game had begun. The first step was to understand the battlefield. She needed to know everything about the Northgate Towers project. She needed the full proposal, the financial backers, the political allies Finch had in his pocket. Professor Albright's offer of university resources was her key. She would have access to databases that could cross-reference property records, campaign donations, and corporate filings. She would be able to trace the flow of money and influence in a way that no ordinary citizen could. Finch operated in the shadows, using complex legal and financial structures to hide his predatory actions. Ilara was about to drag him, and his entire operation, into the light. She knew the work would be painstaking, a slow and frustrating process of connecting disparate pieces of information until a clear picture of his criminality emerged. Her strategy would not be one of direct confrontation, not yet. That would be playing his game, a game of power and intimidation where he held all the cards. Her approach would be different. It would be a game of information, of precision, of using his own system against him. She would be a ghost in his machine, silently gathering the evidence she needed to dismantle his empire from the inside out. He had underestimated her once, seeing only a waitress. He would never even know she was his enemy until it was far too late. His arrogance, the very thing that made him feel invincible, was the critical vulnerability she would exploit. He believed he was untouchable, and that belief would make him careless. It would make him blind to the quiet, methodical threat that was now aimed directly at the heart of his world. She thought about the 5 men who had attacked the restaurant. They had used brute force, an explosion of rage born from desperation. Their attack was chaotic, emotional, and ultimately ineffective. It had only served to get them arrested while Finch walked away, angrier but fundamentally unscathed. Elara understood their rage. She felt it in her own bones, but she knew it was not the path to victory. Her revenge would not be a chaotic explosion. It would be a controlled demolition. She would carefully and precisely place charges at the foundational pillars of his power, his finances, his reputation, his legal standing. And then, when the time was right, she would press the detonator and watch the entire corrupt edifice collapse into dust. It would be clean, it would be total, and it would be just. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside her window, Elara was still at her desk, the single sheet of paper now covered in a complex web of names, arrows, and questions. She felt no fatigue. The exhaustion that had been her constant companion for years had been burned away by the fire of her new purpose. She was no longer just surviving day to day, trapped in a cycle of grief and service. She was planning, she was building, she was hunting. The world had tried to make her small, to make her invisible, to crush her spirit under the weight of tragedy and injustice. But it had failed. It had inadvertently given her access to her enemy and provided her with a cause so powerful it eclipsed all fear. The waitress from Aurelia was gone, and in her place sat a master strategist preparing for the most important game of her life. She remembered a core principle from Professor Albright's game theory class: asymmetric warfare. It was how a smaller, weaker force could defeat a larger, more powerful opponent. It wasn't about matching strength for strength, but about changing the rules of engagement, exploiting weaknesses the opponent doesn't even know they have, and turning their greatest strengths into liabilities. Finch's strength was his immense wealth and public power, but his weakness was his complete inability to see a threat coming from below, from the world of the ants he so despised. Elara was that threat. She was the unanticipated variable, the ghost in the data, and she was about to demonstrate to Alistair Finch that the most dangerous person in the world is the one you don't see coming. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and she already knew her next 10 moves. Her plan began to solidify, taking shape in the quiet hours of the morning. Phase 1 would be reconnaissance. Using the university's resources, she would build a complete dossier on Finch, his company, and the Northgate project. She would become the world's leading expert on Alistair Finch's corrupt empire. She needed to understand his patterns, his methods, his network of enablers. She would follow the money, knowing that it would leave a trail that even the most careful criminal could not fully erase. This initial phase required patience and meticulous attention to detail, skills she had honed both in her academic studies and in the demanding, observation-rich environment of the high-end service industry. She knew how to watch, how to listen, and how to go unnoticed while gathering information. Phase 2 would be identifying the weak point. Every corrupt system had a flaw, a single point of failure that, if struck, could cause a cascading collapse. It might be a disgruntled former employee, a hidden financial irregularity, or a piece of buried evidence from a past crime. Finding this weakness would be the heart of her investigation. It would require her to dig deeper than anyone had before, to connect the dots between Finch's current project and his past transgressions. The Southwood project, the one that destroyed her family, was not just the source of her motivation. It was the source of her motivation. It was also the crime scene, and she was determined to find the evidence that had been buried there for years. The Southwood case was the key. If she could prove Finch's criminality there, she could create a precedent, a pattern of behavior that would make his plans for Northgate not just suspect, but indefensible. It was a long shot, a cold case buried under years of legal maneuvering and faded memories, but it was the only path that led to true justice. Her father's ghost would guide her through the labyrinth of the past, his stolen voice a silent scream in her ears, pushing her forward through the darkness, one breadcrumb of data at a time. The hunt had officially begun, and Alara Vance, the Invisible Woman, was now the most dangerous predator in Alistair Finch's gilded jungle. The contrast between Aurelia and Professor Albright's laboratory at MIT was a collision of two separate universes. The lab was not a space of polished obsidian and silent deferential service. It was a place of chaotic, vibrant creation. The air smelled of old books, hot electronics, and the faint, sharp scent of ozone from the humming server racks that lined one wall. Instead of crystal chandeliers, there were fluorescent lights that cast a flat, honest glow on everything. Blueprints and city maps were tacked to every available surface, covered in a scrawl of red ink and complex equations. It was a space dedicated to solving problems, not hiding from them. For Alara, stepping into this room was like coming home after years in exile. The familiar hum of the servers was a symphony, and the sight of the cluttered workstations a balm to her soul. This was where she belonged, not in the sterile, high-altitude prison of the restaurant. Professor Albright, with his kind, intelligent eyes and his sleeves rolled up, was the antithesis of Alistair Finch. He didn't offer power or money. He offered something far more valuable: knowledge and the tools to wield it. Professor Albright did not coddle her or offer simple solutions. He treated her not as a victim, but as the brilliant colleague he had always known her to be. He gave her a security keycard, a high-level login to the university's immense digital archives, and a simple, powerful instruction. He said, "Finch's power is built on a foundation of lies, but those lies have to be documented somewhere. He uses LLCs to hide ownership. He uses legal loopholes to bypass regulations, and he uses political donations to buy influence. Every one of those actions, no matter how well hidden, leaves a digital footprint. Your job is to find the pattern in the noise." He pointed her to the LexisNexis database, to archives of city planning minutes, to financial disclosure records. He gave her the map and the compass. It was up to her to navigate the treacherous terrain. He trusted her intellect completely, a vote of confidence that felt like a suit of armor, protecting her from the lingering doubts and fears that whispered in the back of her mind. The first week was a descent into a digital rabbit hole. Alara worked with a relentless, focused intensity that bordered on obsession. She survived on stale coffee and vending machine sandwiches, often sleeping for a few hours on a cot in the corner of the lab. Her world shrank to the glowing screen of the high-resolution monitor before her. She began by building a vast, interconnected mind map of Finch's corporate structure. Apex Global Properties was the visible sun, but orbiting it was a complex solar system of smaller, anonymous bodies. Shell corporations with names like Viridian Holdings and Oak Haven Management appeared again and again in property deeds and zoning applications. Tracing their ownership was like trying to follow a single drop of water in the ocean. The trail would lead through a dozen law firms, bounce to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and then disappear completely into the anonymous void of corporate secrecy. The frustration was immense, a constant grinding battle against legal firewalls and deliberate obfuscation. There were moments when despair threatened to overwhelm her. As she stared at another encrypted file or another dead-end LLC, the image of her father's vacant stare would flash in her mind. The sheer scale of Finch's operation, The layers upon layers of protection he had built around himself seemed insurmountable. He wasn't just a man, he was a fortress, designed by the most expensive lawyers and accountants in the world. What was she? A disgraced waitress with a borrowed computer, against such an impenetrable structure. In these moments of doubt, she would close her eyes and remember the feeling of the salt shaker in her hand, the cold, hard certainty of her plan in the midst of chaos. She would remember the look of stunned comprehension in the bodyguard's eyes. She had found a way then, and she would find a way now. The anger she felt was not a wild, consuming fire, but a cold, clean fuel, powering the analytical engine of her mind, pushing her to look closer, to dig deeper, to find the one loose thread that could unravel it all. The breakthrough came not from a financial database, but from a forgotten corner of the university's social sciences archive. She stumbled upon a doctoral thesis written 12 years ago about the socio-economic impact of urban renewal projects. The thesis focused on 3 specific neighborhoods, and one of them was Southwood. She devoured the 200-page document, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and excitement. The student who wrote it had conducted dozens of interviews with residents, community leaders, and city officials. Buried deep in the appendices, in a transcript of an anonymous interview with a mid-level employee from the city's planning department, she found it. The interviewee spoke of intense pressure from a developer to approve zoning variances for the Southwood project. He mentioned falsified environmental impact studies and engineering reports that were pushed through without proper oversight. He named the developer Apex Global Properties. And then he named the man who personally delivered the doctored reports, a city planner named Julian Croft. The name Julian Croft became her new obsession. A quick search revealed that Croft had been a rising star in the city planning department, a man known for his meticulous work and his commitment to community-centric design. Then, 10 years ago, his career had abruptly ended. He had resigned suddenly, citing, quote, personal reasons, and had vanished from public life. There was a whisper of a scandal, an internal investigation that was quietly closed, but no official record of wrongdoing. To Ilara, his disappearance was not a coincidence. It was a confession. Croft was the weak link. He was the man on the inside who had been forced to compromise his principles, the one person who knew exactly how Finch had manipulated the system. He was the ghost at the heart of the machine, and she knew she had to find him. He was no longer just a name in a dusty thesis. He was the key that could unlock everything. Finding Julian Croft was a challenge of a different kind. He had not simply left his job. He had erased himself. He had no social media presence, no current address on file, no digital footprint to follow. He had gone completely analog in a digital world. This was where Ilara's unique skills in logistics and pattern recognition came into play. She started with old property records, tracing the sale of his city apartment. From there, she followed a faint trail of utility bills and vehicle registrations, a series of breadcrumbs that led her from the city to the suburbs, and then further into the rural quiet of upstate New York. She cross-referenced voter registration rules with local tax maps, slowly narrowing the search area. It felt like tracking a ghost, but she was relentless. She saw it as another puzzle, a logistical problem with a hidden solution. After 3 days of methodical, painstaking work, she found him. He was living in a small, run-down cabin on the edge of a lake, 150 miles from the city he had once helped to shape. She drove there in Professor Albright's old, sputtering Volvo, the journey giving her time to strategize her approach. She couldn't come at him like an investigator or a reporter. That would only make him retreat further into his shell. She had to approach him as a fellow victim of Alistair Finch's scorched earth campaign. When she arrived, she found a man who was a shell of his former self. His hair was gray and unkempt, his face etched with the deep lines of a long-held guilt. He was wary and defensive when she introduced herself, his eyes full of a haunted, hunted look. He denied knowing anything, his voice rough with disuse. He told her to leave, that he had nothing to say, that the past was the past. He was a man drowning in his own silence, terrified of the powerful man who had sent him into this self-imposed exile. He had made a deal with the devil years ago, and he was still paying the price. Alara didn't push, she didn't threaten him with exposure. Instead, she sat down on the rickety porch step of his cabin and began to speak. She didn't talk about zoning laws or environmental reports. She talked about her father. She described the man he had been, a community leader with a booming laugh and hands that could fix anything. She described his fierce, hopeless fight to save their neighborhood, the sleepless nights, the mounting legal bills, the slow, crushing weight of a battle he could never win. She described the day of his stroke, the awful, silent finality of it. Her voice was quiet, devoid of accusation, a simple, heartbreaking recitation of the facts. She was not trying to manipulate him. She was sharing her grief, offering him a piece of her own pain. She was connecting the abstract crime he had enabled to its devastating human consequence, giving a face and a name to the collateral damage of his long-ago decision. As she spoke, she saw a change in Julian Croft's face. The hard mask of denial began to crack. His eyes, which had been darting around nervously, finally met hers, and she saw in them a flicker of profound, soul-deep shame. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. When she finished her story, the silence between them was heavy with the weight of a decade of unspoken truths. He finally broke, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of complete and utter defeat. It all came pouring out of him, a torrent of confession and regret. He told her everything. He explained how Finch had trapped him, using a combination of veiled threats against his family and the promise of a lucrative future. He described the process of systematically replacing legitimate environmental and structural surveys with fraudulent documents drafted by Finch's own engineers. He confirmed that bribes, disguised as, quote, consulting fees, were paid to key members of the Oversight Committee. Croft's confession was a dam breaking, the release of a pressure he had been holding inside for 10 long years. He detailed the entire corrupt process with the sad precision of a man who had replayed his sins in his mind 1,000 times. He explained that Finch was a master of plausible deniability, never putting his own name on the most damning documents, always using intermediaries and shell corporations to do his dirty work. But the original, fraudulent reports, the ones Croft himself had been forced to submit, were the smoking gun. They were the physical proof of the conspiracy, the irrefutable evidence of racketeering and fraud. Alara listened intently, her mind recording every detail, every name, every date. She had found her validator, the human witness who could corroborate her entire theory. The fortress that was Alistair Finch had a crack in it, and she now knew exactly where it was. She asked him the most important question: where is the proof? Do you have copies of the original reports? A look of fear returned to Croft's eyes. He shook his head. No, he said. Finch was too careful for that. All copies were supposed to have been destroyed. But he knew Finch's protocol. For legal and insurance purposes, Finch's firm was required to maintain a physical archive of all project documentation for a minimum of 15 years. Finch didn't trust digital storage for his most sensitive secrets. He was old school. He kept a hard copy of everything in a high-security, climate-controlled off-site storage facility, a corporate fortress called Iron Mountain Archives, located in a nondescript industrial park in New Jersey. Croft explained that getting into that facility was impossible. It was a vault with biometric scanners, armed guards, and round-the-clock surveillance. The original Southwood files would be buried in there, box number and shelf number known only to Finch and his most trusted lieutenants. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The proof existed. It was not a digital ghost, but a physical object, a stack of paper sitting in a cardboard box, waiting. The challenge was no longer one of research, it was one of infiltration. A direct assault was out of the question. She couldn't hack her way in, and she couldn't force her way in. She had to be cleverer than that. Her mind immediately began to work on the problem, not as a heist, but as a systems analysis. Iron Mountain was a system, with rules, protocols, and procedures, and every system had a vulnerability. She thanked Julian Croft, leaving him with a promise that his confession would be used not to punish him, but to bring down the man who had ruined both of their lives. For the first time in a decade, she saw a glimmer of something other than fear in Croft's eyes. It was a fragile, flickering hope. On the long drive back to the city, the plan began to form in her mind, a daring and intricate strategy born from her unique understanding of game theory and human behavior. She would not try to break into Iron Mountain. She would be invited in. She spent the next 2 days back in the lab, not digging through archives, but studying the protocols of corporate auditing firms. She learned their language, their procedures, their documentation. With Professor Albright's help, she identified the small, third-party firm that Apex Global Properties used for their routine annual archival audits. They were a small, overworked company, the kind of place where a new face in a junior role would likely go unnoticed. Her plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would become one of them. She would engineer a situation where she was assigned to the Apex audit, a low-priority procedural task that no senior auditor would want. Professor Albright, initially hesitant about the legality and the risk, was ultimately convinced by the elegant logic of her plan. He saw it not as a reckless gamble, but as a calculated move in a high-stakes chess match. He helped her create the necessary cover. They fabricated a resume, created a digital identity, and even managed to get her name onto a temporary employment roster for the auditing firm through a contact of a contact. It was a series of small, believable deceptions, each one a carefully placed stepping stone leading her toward her goal. She was no longer just a researcher, she was becoming an operative, a ghost preparing to slip unnoticed into the heart of the enemy's stronghold. Her target was not money or secrets in general, it was one specific box of files, the files for the Southwood project. The final days of preparation were a blur of intense focus. Alara studied the internal layout of the Iron Mountain facility, memorizing blueprints she found online. She learned the names of the shift supervisors. She practiced the bland, professional demeanor of a junior auditor, a role not so different from the invisible waitress she had once played. She traded her jeans and sweatshirt for a conservative, gray business suit, a costume that felt both alien and empowering. The suit was her new uniform, another mask that would allow her to move through a world where she didn't belong. She was transforming herself, shedding the skin of Alara Vance, the victim, and stepping into the role of a quiet, methodical agent of justice. The fear was there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of clarity and purpose. The morning of the audit arrived, a crisp, clear autumn day. Alara stood across the street from the Iron Mountain facility. It was an imposing, windowless cube of concrete and steel, a modern-day fortress designed to protect the secrets of the powerful. It looked impenetrable. To anyone else it would have been the end of the line, a literal concrete wall. But to Alara, it was just the final door she needed to walk through. She clutched the handle of her briefcase, which contained not just auditing forms, but a high-resolution digital scanner and a heart that was beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a soldier before a battle. She had all the evidence, all the witnesses, all the knowledge. The only thing she lacked was the one piece of irrefutable, physical proof that would tie it all together. And it was waiting for her, just a few hundred feet away, inside that concrete box. She took a deep, steadying breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She thought of her father, of the community that had been shattered, of the life that had been stolen from her. This was not about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. It was about balancing the scales. Alistair Finch had built his empire on the ruins of other people's lives, believing himself to be above the ants he crushed under his feet. He had fired a waitress, never imagining that in doing so, he had unleashed the one person in the world with the intellect, the motivation, and the courage to bring his entire world crashing down. She smoothed the front of her jacket, adjusted the fake ID badge clipped to her lapel, and began to walk across the street. The game was entering its final phase. The checkmate was in sight. She was ready. Her steps were measured and confident as she approached the main entrance. The polished glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sterile, silent lobby manned by 2 armed guards. The air inside was cold and still, smelling faintly of recycled air and security. One of the guards, a large man with a bored expression, looked up from his monitor as she approached. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, taking in the cheap but professional suit, the briefcase, the ID badge. He was the first gatekeeper, the first test of her disguise. For a split second, the image of herself in her waitress uniform flashed in her mind, a ghost of the person she had been just weeks ago. She felt a flicker of imposter syndrome, a voice whispering that she did not belong here, that she would be discovered at any moment. She silenced it with a cold, hard wave of resolve. She met the guard's gaze with a look of bland, professional indifference. She stated her name and the name of the auditing firm, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The guard grunted, checking his list. He found her name, just as she and Albright had planned. He handed her a visitor's pass and a clipboard, gesturing vaguely toward a set of reinforced steel doors. Down the hall, to the left. Someone from records will meet you. He had already dismissed her from his mind, another faceless corporate drone performing another meaningless task. She had passed the first test. Her invisibility, once a source of shame and frustration, was now her most powerful weapon. As she walked down the sterile corridor, the heavy steel door buzzing open before her, she knew that Alistair Finch's carefully constructed world was about to be dismantled by the one person he had never even bothered to see. The records manager who met her was a harried-looking man named Henderson, a man drowning in a sea of paperwork. He was exactly the kind of overworked, underappreciated employee Alara had hoped for. He saw her not as a threat, but as another task to be checked off his list. He led her into the archive itself, and the sheer scale of it took her breath away. It was a cathedral of secrets, a vast, cold cavern filled with towering shelves that stretched up into the darkness, disappearing from view. Each shelf was packed with thousands upon thousands of identical cardboard boxes, each one a tombstone for a corporate decision, a legal battle, a secret deal. The air was dry and cold, and the only sound was the low hum of the climate control system. It was a library of corporate power, and somewhere in this endless maze was the weapon she needed. Henderson pointed her to a section marked Apex Global Properties. "There are over 2,000 boxes here," he said with a sigh. "The audit requires a random sampling of 20 boxes from the last fiscal year." He handed her a list of randomly generated box numbers. "Let me know when you're done." He then retreated to his small, glass-walled office, eager to get back to his own work. Ilara stood alone in the aisle, surrounded by the physical manifestation of Finch's empire. The list of box numbers in her hand was her legitimate cover. But her true target was not on that list. Julian Croft had not known the exact box number, but he had told her how Finch's archaic filing system worked. It was chronological and departmental. She knew the year, and she knew the department. Project Development Southwood. It would be in this section, somewhere. She began her work, pulling the designated boxes from the audit list, creating a legitimate reason for her presence in the aisle. She opened each box, dutifully checking the contents against the manifest, playing the part of the diligent auditor. But her eyes were constantly scanning the labels on the shelves, moving backward in time, year by year. 10 years ago. 9. 8. The years of her father's decline, the years of her lost future, were filed away here, in neat, chronological order. A cold fury settled in her heart, giving her a sharp, predatory focus. Her movements were efficient and quiet, the rustle of paper the only sound she made. She was a ghost haunting the archives of the man who had destroyed her life, and she was getting closer. Then she saw it. Tucked away on a high shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust, was a box with a label that made her heart stop. The label was simple: typed on an old-fashioned label maker. Project SW. Date 10 years ago. SW Southwood. It had to be it. The box was not on her official audit list. Accessing it would be a direct violation of her protocol. If Henderson saw her, if anyone checked the surveillance footage, she would be exposed immediately. This was the moment of greatest risk. She glanced toward the glass office. Henderson was on the phone, his back to her. It was now or never. Her hands, which had been so steady, began to tremble slightly. She took a breath, the cold, dry air searing her lungs, and reached for the box. The cardboard was cool and dry to the touch. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the secrets and the suffering it contained. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she carefully lifted the box from the shelf and carried it back to the small workstation she had been assigned. She placed it under the table, out of sight of the office, and then placed one of the official audit boxes on top of the table. Her hands moved with practiced speed as she opened the Southwood box. The smell that wafted out was the smell of old paper and stale secrets. And there they were. The fraudulent environmental reports, the falsified structural surveys, the internal memos detailing the pressure campaign against the community. And at the bottom of the pile, the document she had only dreamed of finding, a signed directive from Alistair Finch himself, authorizing the use of the falsified documents. His signature was there, arrogant and unmistakable. It was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof. She didn't have time to read everything. She pulled out the small, powerful digital scanner from her briefcase. Disguised as a portable power bank, it was silent and efficient. Page by page, she began to digitize the evidence. Each quiet flash of the scanner was a nail being hammered into Alistair Finch's coffin. She captured the signed directive, the most damning of the engineering reports, and the internal memos. Every file was a piece of the story, a testament to a crime that had been buried for a decade. As the last page was scanned, a profound sense of grim satisfaction washed over her. She had it. She had the weapon. The hunt was over. Now all that was left was the execution. She carefully placed the documents back in the box, returned it to its dusty shelf, and sealed it away, a tomb for a secret that was about to be resurrected in the most public way imaginable. She finished her official audit work with a calm, methodical focus, her mind already leaping ahead, planning the final confrontation. She thanked the distracted Henderson, signed out at the front desk, and walked out of the concrete fortress, back into the bright sunlight. The briefcase in her hand no longer felt like a prop, it felt like a warhead. The data it contained was more powerful than any amount of money or political influence. It was the truth. As she walked away from Iron Mountain, she did not look back. Her gaze was fixed on the glittering skyline of the city in the distance, the city that Alistair Finch thought he owned. The board was set. The pieces were in place. And the Queen, who had started the game as a pawn, was finally ready to make her final devastating move. The downfall of Alistair Finch was no longer a matter of if, but when. The City Planning Commission chamber was a theater of beige and muted power, a stark contrast to the celestial grandeur of Aurelia. The air was thick with the scent of recycled air, old paper, and the nervous sweat of petitioners. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glow on the rows of uncomfortable wooden chairs and the polished dais where the commission members sat like a panel of bored gods. Alistair Finch was in his element, standing at a sleek podium, a large screen behind him displaying elegant architectural renderings of the Northgate Towers. He was a master of this domain, his voice a smooth, confident baritone as he spoke of progress, prosperity, and the inevitable, glorious march of urban renewal. He painted a picture of a gleaming future, a utopia of glass and steel that would rise from the underutilized and blighted grounds of a neighborhood he was actively planning to erase. He was charming, he was persuasive, and he was utterly despicably convincing to those who did not know the true cost of his vision. He was the king, once again secure on his throne, completely unaware that the ghost of his past was sitting in the third row, waiting patiently for her turn to speak. Alara watched him, her heart a steady, slow drum against her ribs. She was dressed in the same simple, gray suit she had worn to Iron Mountain, a uniform of anonymity that allowed her to blend into the sea of city bureaucrats and concerned citizens. In her lap, a simple leather portfolio held the entirety of her case, the digital file safely stored on a small, encrypted drive in her pocket. As Finch spoke, his words washing over the room, Alara did not hear the promises of a brighter future. She heard the echoes of the past, the same seductive lies that had been whispered to the residents of Southwood before the bulldozers arrived. She saw her father, standing at a similar podium in a cramped community hall, his voice hoarse with passion as he tried to fight this very man with logic and reason, armed with nothing but the truth. He had lost. But she was not her father. She had not come here to plead, she had come here to prosecute, and this sterile chamber was her courtroom. She looked at Finch, a predator so confident in his dominance that he never bothered to scan the herd for threats, and felt a profound, icy calm settle over her. When Finch concluded his presentation to a smattering of polite applause, the commission chairman, a man with a tired, expressionless face, consulted his list of speakers. "Our next speaker," he announced, his voice devoid of interest, "is from the Northgate Community Defense Fund, Alara Vance." A low murmur rippled through the room. Finch, who had been turning to sit, paused. He glanced over his shoulder, a flicker of annoyance on his face at this procedural delay. His eyes scanned the room and landed on Alara as she rose from her seat. For a fraction of a second, there was no recognition in his gaze. He saw only a woman in a cheap suit. Another insignificant obstacle, another ant. Then, as she began to walk toward the podium, something shifted. A flicker of memory, a ghost of an encounter in a chaotic restaurant. His eyes narrowed slightly, a faint, condescending smile touching his lips. He remembered her now. The waitress. He visibly relaxed, turning to one of his lawyers with a dismissive whisper, a gesture that clearly communicated how little he thought of this interruption. The arrogance that was his defining trait had just become his fatal flaw. Alara reached the podium, the polished wood cool beneath her fingertips. She did not look at the commission members, she did not look at the audience, she looked directly at Alistair Finch. Her voice, when she spoke into the microphone, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and carried to every corner of the room, a blade of pure clarity in the stuffy air. She began, "Mr. Finch has presented a compelling vision for the future of Northgate, a vision built on data, projections, and a promise of prosperity. But the most reliable predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So before we look forward, I would like the Commission to join me in taking a brief look back." She turned to the audio-visual technician. "Sir, could you please display the file labeled Exhibit A from this drive?" The technician, looking to the chairman for approval, received a bored nod and complied. A moment later, Finch's elegant rendering of Northgate Towers vanished from the large screen. It was replaced by a scanned image of a document, a dry, technical engineering report, blown up for all to see. It was the fraudulent structural survey for the Southwood project. Finch's condescending smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He stared at the screen, the document vaguely familiar, but its context lost to him. Alara's voice continued, calm and methodical, the voice of a professor delivering a lecture. "This is the original geological survey submitted for the Southwood Revitalization Project 10 years ago, a project also spearheaded by Apex Global Properties. It asserts that the bedrock in the area was perfectly stable, suitable for high-rise construction with standard foundations. A perfectly routine document. Now, could we see Exhibit B?" The screen changed, displaying a second report side by side with the first. It was the real report, the one Julian Croft had kept hidden in his memory for a decade, the one that had been buried. "This," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of a decibel, "is the original, independent survey, conducted by the city's own engineering firm before Mr. Finch's intervention. It clearly states that the area sits on a significant deposit of unstable clay, requiring deep, incredibly expensive caisson foundations. a cost that would have made the entire project unprofitable. The first report is a forgery. A wave of murmurs swept through the chamber. The commission members, who had been slumping in their chairs, were now sitting bolt upright. Finch's face had lost its color, his expression hardening from confusion into a mask of cold fury. He started to speak, to object, but Alara gave him no opening. She pressed on, her timing as precise as a surgeon's incision. This forgery, which endangered future residents and defrauded the city, was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of racketeering, bribery, and intimidation. Exhibit C, please. The screen changed again. This time, it was an internal Apex Global memo. The text was a brutally clear summary of the pressure campaign against the Southwood community leaders, outlining a strategy of legal harassment and financial attrition. And at the bottom of the page, a signature, now magnified to a monstrous size, was unmistakable. It was the arrogant, decisive scrawl of Alistair Finch. A collective gasp went through the room. The flash of a reporter's camera went off in the back. Finch stared at his own signature, a brand that had once been his greatest source of pride, now a damning indictment from which he could not escape. His empire, his entire world, was collapsing in real time, projected on a 12-foot screen for the world to see. The mask of power shattered completely, revealing the petty, terrified man beneath. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The smooth, confident baritone was gone, replaced by a strangled, pathetic silence. His hands, which had gestured with such authority only moments before, now gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white. He looked around the room, his eyes wide and pleading, searching for an ally, for a way out. But he found none. He saw only the cold, accusatory stares of the commission, the hungry lenses of the news cameras, and the pitiless, calm gaze of the woman at the podium. The waitress. The aunt. She had done this. In his mind, the carefully ordered world of assets and liabilities, of power and control, was dissolving into pure, terrifying chaos. He had built a fortress of wealth and influence to protect himself, but he had never imagined an attack from within, an enemy who used not force or money, but the simple, undeniable weight of the truth. He was exposed, he was ruined, and in the profound, ringing silence of the chamber, Alistair Finch finally, completely, broke. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. The aftermath was a swift and total implosion. Federal investigators, spurred by the public outcry and the irrefutable evidence Alara had laid bare, descended upon Apex Global Properties. Finch's empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. He was indicted on charges of fraud, racketeering, and bribery. His investors, terrified of the legal and financial contagion, pulled their funding not just from the Northgate project, but from his entire portfolio. The newspapers and cable news channels, which had once celebrated him as a titan of industry, now savaged his reputation, replaying the clip of his silent, slack-jawed collapse in the commission chamber over and over. He lost everything: his company, his fortune, his freedom, but most importantly, he lost the one thing he valued above all else: his power. The king was dethroned, his reign of casual cruelty brought to an end not by a rival billionaire or a government agency, but by a quiet, brilliant woman he had wronged, and then foolishly, fatally, underestimated. Months later, Alara stood not in a sterile boardroom or an exclusive restaurant, but in the brightly lit gymnasium of a community center. The air smelled of floor wax and coffee, and the room was filled with the lively, chaotic chatter of the residents of Northgate. She was no longer wearing a uniform of service or a costume of anonymity. She was wearing simple, comfortable clothes, and she was at a podium once again. But this time, she was not there to tear down. She was there to build. After the Finch scandal, a respected ethical developer on the City Planning Commission, a woman who had watched Alara's presentation with a sense of awe, had sought her out. She hadn't just offered Alara a job. She had offered her a mission. She had asked her to create and lead a new division within her firm, a division dedicated to a radical new concept: ethical urban development, a model where communities were partners, not obstacles, a model that valued people over profit. Alara now used her extraordinary mind, not for exfiltration routes or corporate takedowns, but for designing community land trusts, for creating sustainable, affordable housing, and for ensuring that the voices of the residents were the most important ones in any planning meeting. She had turned her weapon into a tool, her gift for seeing systems and pathways now used to create opportunities, to protect the vulnerable, and to build a city that was more just, more equitable, and more human. She had not only reclaimed her own future but was now in a position to safeguard the futures of thousands of others. She had finally found a home for her brilliant mind, a purpose that honored the legacy of the man who had inspired her all along. After the meeting, she drove to the small, sunlit care facility where her father now lived. The settlement from the class action lawsuit against the now bankrupt Apex Global had provided him with the best care money could buy. She found him in the garden, sitting in his new, state-of-the-art wheelchair, a small, contented smile on his face as he watched the birds. His aphasia was still a barrier, a cruel prison for his thoughts, but his eyes were clearer now. The haunted, vacant look was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound peace. She knelt beside him, taking his hand, its skin soft and papery. She told him about her day, about the Northgate project, about the families she was helping. He couldn't respond with words, but he squeezed her hand, and in his eyes, she saw it all. He saw her. He saw not the waitress, not the caregiver, but the brilliant, powerful woman she had become. He saw the fighter he had always raised her to be. And in that silent, shared moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the garden, Alara knew that she had not just won, she had healed. She had balanced the scales, honored her family's name, and transformed a story of grief and injustice into a powerful, enduring legacy of hope. If Alara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.